because they never seen us as full-blooded Mi'kmaq Indians. We're called half-breeds. So growing up in that environment was difficult as well. And if it wasn't for my father not having a will, I wouldn't have been on. We would have been removed from that reservation by the Indian Act. They would have removed us because my father had died and my mother was non-indigenous. So they would have picked us up and moved us. The fact that my father left a will gave my mother the authority to stay there. And that kept us there. So even though I went out to an institution like this to get my, not everything would, finally, nobody knows me, don't know where I'm from, I'd be treated equal, I can be able to move forward, go out with my education, don't even go back to the reserve, sure, assimilate me, as long as I get my professional designation and all that kind of stuff, sure, I'll go through the assimilation process. But when they asked me, Steve, no trouble, here's your degree, you have to give us your status card. You will no longer be a status Indian. And I wasn't thinking of me at that particular time, I was thinking of my children. When my children grow up, what type of identity they're going to have. Because even our women at the time, if they married out, they lost their status. If they left the reserve, they lost their status. So, myself thinking as having it hard as a man on the First Nation, it was 10 folds over for the women on the First Nations. They had no rights to vote, none of this stuff. No rights, no rights with respect to their status, anything like that. If they married a non-Indigenous person, all the children will be non-Indigenous. And so, it just total, as we're growing up, stripping at the culture. And it wasn't until 1972 that we were actually allowed to have representation. And that's when you start seeing Delgamuke, Sparrow, Marshall case, Gray case, all these other court cases coming out, because finally we can have representation. And so you look at the amount of damage that could be done to a group of people right up to just 30 years ago, roughly, 1970, 50 years. I'm getting so old now, I can't even count backwards. But 50 years ago. That's not that long ago. That's one generation. That's my generation. I'm 56 years old. And you experience so many changes in the last 50 years, it's unbelievable. Finally, the last 10 years, it's starting to get more positive. And society's trying to understand why our First Nations seem to be getting a higher standard in society than we are as people of Canada. Understand the history. I always say to people, read the Indian Act. I always say to people, and you'll understand just how detrimental and how genocidal it was to the people of this land. A lot of people in this country, if you're from Irish descent, African descent, European descent, or whatever, if you don't like it here, you can go home. You know what I mean? Go back to your family roots. We can't. We don't like it here. We're already home. We can't go nowhere. This is who we are, so we stay here. So it's difficult to try to recognize a country in dealing with natural resource issues like this when you turn around and you're always told you can't do this, you can't do that, you can't have this. If you get this education, then this is what happens. So one of the things I started working on years ago with a friend up in Natural Resource Canada is a step forward. Is to try to how to move First Nations forward, especially in the forestry sector. And we come up with what we call is a vision, next 5, 10, 15 years, on how to do this. Do we stay with the status quo? The status quo right now is, of course, we have a 5.3% allocation that we can harvest within the Crown lands. The Crown land is Mi'kmaq territory. And that belongs to the Mi'kmaq. But yet we have to ask the government if we can cut on our own land. Can we harvest our own timber in our own land? Or do we become part of the larger contractors? Like, the 5.3% is nothing when you look at the larger contractors who have 50% of the allocation. But here for 15 communities, you give 5.3 allocation, but you'll give one company 50% of the allocation. Where's the fairness? Especially when the treaties turn around and say equal for everybody. We share the land, share the benefits. And of course, one of the big things is form our own organizations. It was illegal for us back in the 70s, in early 80s, to actually form an organization. If we formed an organization, off to jail we go. So we couldn't even legally form any type of organization. And so, talking about forming an organization today is brand new to First Nations. We start first forming Union of New Brunswick Industry, Union of New Brunswick Indians. That's probably one of the oldest organizations in New Brunswick right now. It's kind of an idle, stand-down organization because the Wolastoq people and the Mi'kmaq people formed their separate organizations. But that organization was formed in 1972, after we finally had rights to have legal representation. Prior to that, we had no organization. We weren't allowed. We were known as Indians on the reservation. So these are the things, like people ask, how come you're not participating in forestry? Unless we conformed to industry standard, we weren't allowed. Unless we were assimilated, we weren't allowed. Unless we were able, I can go to the United States today because of the Dre Treaty, don't need a green card, don't need nothing, and I can go work there because of the Dre Treaty. But in Canada at that time, you needed Indian agent's permission. You had to gain some type of professional designation. In order to do that, you had to give up your Indian status card. And the only training we were allowed to get was training to be the laborers, like the maids or just basic labor positions. We were not allowed to go get professional designation. Of course, I'm talking about all this kind of stuff of what needs to be happened. And right now, we're a one-time 100% part of this land. But because of the restrictions placed upon us, we were totally segregated in the reservations. So of course, now getting these legal cases and these legal decisions on our behalf, we talk about expanding scopes. Get more involved in all the forestry resource activities that's happening out there. Bring our knowledge into the sector. Bring Indigenous knowledge into the sector. And, you know, a lot of people say, well, what's Indigenous knowledge? Indigenous knowledge is all around us. 85% of the pharmaceuticals in this world are because of Indigenous knowledge from around the world. A lot of the Indigenous people around the world brought a lot of the medicines that cure a lot of the illnesses that we experience today. Of course, consolidate our forestry services. Right now, like I said, I was the first forestry graduate in '83. There's only 6 of us in the country right now. Only three of them carry the RPF's designation because they graduated before. They graduated after 1985 when they finally pulled away that taking of your Indian card in 1985. But for 3 of us, the first 3 of us, we still don't carry the RPF status because it's part of our history. And you see a lot of First Nation elders getting honorary degrees or honorary designations by various universities now simply because of the fact when they got their education, they also denied taking the accreditation because they were required to give up. And the institution's way to correct that is give them honorary degrees and things like that. So that's why you see some of our elders throughout Canada getting honorary degrees. Those ones were affected by the same thing that I was affected by when I got my degree. I keep saying got my degree. I still don't have the degree because I won't. It's just my history. I never designated. And from what I understand, I tried to get a copy of my transcript there one year. Guess what? All destroyed. They got my first year university and part of my second year. That's all they can find. All the rest of it, I guess, was destroyed. I tried to find it, Cecilia, about a month ago. Just my curiosity to see if I was still on record here. of course, and achieve stewardship status. There's one thing we want to show industry and government. If you let us participate, if we're allowed to participate the way we want to participate, we can achieve any type of accreditation or certification in the world. And we proved that in Eelgraund. We achieved FSC certification in 2005. That's the highest standard of sustainable certification that you can get in the world. We achieved it. The only other group that achieved it in New Brunswick was Falls Brook Center, which is like an NGO group, but also Pictou Landon in Nova Scotia, another First Nation. So there's two First Nations that achieved FSC certification when the industry itself can't. So, you know, it's difficult to understand why we can't participate, but yet we can achieve the highest standard of certification that's asked of organizations when it comes to forestry certification. Big thing, inclusion within management and jurisdictional responsibility on forestry crown land. We're just starting to go down this road of a Mi'kmaq National Strategic Plan, Mi'kmaq Nation Strategic Plan, as a foundation to start this process. I just came from a meeting this morning at Canadian Forest Service where we finally kind of pulled the trigger on building a Mi'kmaq forestry strategy for New Brunswick First Nations. I used to sit on the chair of the National Aboriginal Forestry Association. I chaired that for 10 years. And we developed what was called the First Nation Forest Management Manual, or Act. That was to replace the Indian Act. Because a lot of people don't understand, when it comes to forest management, when I used to go out there and plant that tree, or build that road, put that culvert in, I could have been charged by the federal government, because when I practice sustainable management on reserve territory, it's illegal. Still to this day. Because what governs management on First Nation reserve land is the Timber Regulation Act under the Indian Act, which allows me to sell all I can. I can go in the Eelgraund right now, take that FSC forest, cut it all down, sell it, but if I plant that tree, I can get thrown in jail. What's funny about that is that a lot of the programming that allowed us, and this is what's so funny about it, that allowed us to do some management on First Nation lands were part of what they call the Further 1s, Forest Renewal Agreements, Further 2s, First Nation Forestry Program, and currently now the Indigenous Forestry Initiative, where you have federal programming that wants First Nations to address sustainable forest management on First Nations, but yet the act that allows it says you can't do it. So here you got a federal program totally going against their own acts and regulations when it comes to sustainably managing land. It's so hypocritical of them, especially since they talk about sustainable management, taking care of the environment, you know, all the issues around climate change and carbon credits and things like that, but yet they have absolutely no policies that actually talks about sustainable management on First Nation lands. So anything I used to do management-wise, I risk going to jail.